like it's opening. Yay!
We don't take things for granted.
Yeah, or you can stand there and look at that, and I can do this every time you do it, whatever you want.
Okay, thanks, and sorry for the delay. I should have said the earlier. Can everybody hear me okay? Sometimes I talk a little softer now. Anyway, so it's been, I'm now at Montreal, we have this redid by the research team, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And I've been there for 33 years, so I like to spend some time in between here in education and psychology. So first I want to start by thanking Corey and Avital for helping to arrange all of this. Thank you. And then Christy Atkinson and Francesca were two of my graduates, so it's a privilege. So before I start, I just wanted to say that this week, especially as I was walking through the old city today, I felt like, I just want to show you what the other side of the road looks like, when we do research. So this is Canada. So I'm going to talk today, as Corey mentioned, about my work with autistic people and neurodevelopmental conditions. But there's another side of my work, which is I'll try and get to it at some point, but working with Indigenous people in the north of Canada. And my students and I, and some colleagues, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues, are studying the ways that cultural identity and how kids identify as Indigenous or not, and how that affects, hopefully promote, usually how they identify as Indigenous and how that promotes success, especially educationally, but also emotionally and socially, and this connection between identity and how people think of themselves. And that to me has become an interesting part, even though, as Corey said, most of my research may be considered sort of on the edge of neuropsychology of autism, its attention and its perception, it's a lot about how people think about themselves. So as I was preparing to talk today, and I'll get to this later on, I was thinking, I was listening, I was multitasking, as we all do nowadays. So I was on the airplane, my son was sitting next to me and talking to me, and I was trying to prepare this talk. And I was also watching a movie, right? I'm on a plane, most of my kids aren't around, I don't have a chance to watch a movie. And I was watching Tar. Have you ever seen the movie Tar? It's about a female conductor. It's a controversial, with Kate Blanchett, I think it is. And it's it's a terrifically well done movie. It's a little bit controversial because they're frail for sort of abusive. But there's a scene where she's being interviewed. Early in the movie, she's being interviewed as this very prominent female conductor. And she's, although it's not very true, what did she learn from Leonard Bernstein? Although if the years add up, they don't really match. But, anyways, what did you learn from Leonard Bernstein? Of course, that's a musical connection here in Israel. And she said, one of the things she said is the word, when Leonard told me, or she's Lenin, the word is kavanah. She says kavanah, which is a Hebrew word, and she interprets it as intent. And what Bernstein was trying to, what she's trying to get, Bernstein's trying to teach her, is as a conductor, what's the intent of the composer? And how then what is your intent to fulfill the conductor's intent, but still make it essentially you as a conductor somehow? And it's clear to me that this is what we do in some ways. This is what we should, I shouldn't say what we do, what we should do. Is what is the intent of our research? How do we understand it? And how does that match with the intent of the people who are with the lived experience, the people who are participating in research, the people who are the beneficiaries of the research, and how do we match the intents of our size researchers, on educators, on professionals, and on the people who are the stakeholders along the ways. And that intent, and the idea also is, when Bernstein has an intent of what he sees his music being, or the composer's music, each conductor is somehow able to shape it in their own way. And that's part of what researchers, I think, is trying, how do we shape what we think about? And how do we shape it so that it meets the autism. So that's what we're trying to talk about today. And to premise my talk, I just have to say, like to tell a story. You know, I have, my grandfather was a very well-known rabbinic scholar. So we're told that when he spoke, he always used to start his speeches by, before I began, let me tell you something. And he would go on and on and on. And then they would give him extra time to give a speech. So, so I'm going to start by just saying that this talk is unlike a lot of talks that we hear in academia where people come and talk about the research that they've done. This is going to be research that work that, and I'll get to it, that I'm thinking about. So it's not what we've done, what we're thinking about. It's trying to work through and hopefully maybe if we have time, for some input, it would be great to get some suggestions. So let's begin by saying quickly that my research is done with, over the years, and that was a great team of students and colleagues. This is back again, started quite a few years ago, but it's a series of my students who've gone on to become scholars in autism. Grace Road, she is a professor at South Fraser in Canada. Cheryl Clayman is the clinical director of the Marcus Center at Emory University. Oriana Landry's in Australia. Terrifying is a colleague of mine at McGill. Natalie Russo is an associate professor at Syracuse University, runs a big research group. And Tammy Dawkins runs the TEACH program in UNC Chapel Hill. And these people are very involved in the research over the years in different ways. And your names will come up throughout the talk. And so a lot of these ideas are ideas that we've developed over the years together as a group. Hannah Koshoff, who's at the University of Southampton, is another student, and Karen Goldman is also helping participate in a lot of this work that we've done over the years. So just want to say it's really a team effort in some of these ideas that we're getting at. So Friday's story begins. Almost we'll get into it. So as I said, this is beginning. So when Corey and I talked about coming and giving the talk today, it was actually, I couldn't decide, obsessed about titles and what I should read about. And I haven't been traveling much since before COVID, so anyways, one of the things that I do. And there are two things that happened just as we were coming up with this date. Two things that happened, or two projects that came about. And one of them is an invitation to submit an article in a special issue, which is going to be the last issue of 2024 in the Journal of Development and Psychopathology, and it's going to be in honor and commemoration of the work that Dr. H.K. has done. We've essentially found the field of developmental psychology as a formal discipline. And it is, so it's a special issue, it's a talk is going to be heading. And most of the people who are contributing to that special issue will talk his later work, which has to do with all sorts of issues about risk resilience, neuroscience, and all stuff. But our group is going to talk about his early work, his PhD work back in Minnesota. And the title is Liberal Developmental Approach, really to intellectual disability, really is a precursor to science of neurodiversity from a research perspective. I want to talk about that and why it's important in the colloquies way. And then the second, he just, as it turns out, he just got an honorary degree at McGill. So there's pictures of him getting his honorary degree at McGill, which are fancy occasions here, there as they are here. So that's one of them. And then the second one was we had just got funding from, in Canada, there's three major funding agencies, a natural science and engineering one in medical medicine, and then there's also social science and humanities research council of Canada. And we just got funding for a large grant, by Canadian standards, a grant called Utilitarian Processing, a new strengths-based approach to examine unique ways that autistic persons understand the world in which they live. And we'll get to that also as part of our work that we've been doing. Again, that's with a whole bunch of folks who I will introduce. We'll get to it. So the first part is really about the developmental approach as a precursor to the science of neurodiversity. I just say perspectives from attention research, but I'm not sure there's anything left of that. Now we'll get to it. So I want to talk about Corey mentioned, he'll come up in a second, is that I studied with Ziegler, and I'll talk about that. But the idea is a developmental approach, and it means really using developmental psychology as a guide. It's sort of traditional developmental psychology, with Heinz Werner and Jean Piaget. It's a model of universality and inclusivity, the other words. I'll talk about this. It's an opposition to sort of, these are, not this exact, but sort of medical models or special education models, where we think about we categorize people, right? We categorize people. So they have this disability, they have this problem, this pathology. And the idea is, by imposing a developmental framework, you're using a universal framework. When you think about the first question is universality, humanity, as opposed to how are people different. So how are people similar? And then we work sort of from there. And that's sort of the premise, at least from a conceptual level. I always start my class when I teach, students about developmental theory or pretty any course I teach. The way I start, I'm actually coming up with a textbook on neurodevelopmental conditions, and I have with Grace Hirochi. And I start off, a picture. I show people a picture of Yao Ming. This is a picture taken from the China Olympics. Who's a basketball player? Who's a 7'6" basketball player from China. And then Sean Johnson, who was a 5', Shannon Johnson from the States, was 5 feet tall, white American gymnast. And I say, tell me about these two people. Right? And people always say, well, he's tall, she's short, he's Asian, she's white, and they always start off talking about how people are different. And nobody ever says, we never start with what's similar about them, right? And we do this on a regular basis. And part of it, and even more so when we work with people with different conditions, is we always say how people do it. And part of this idea is not to say there's not differences, but what's the overall thinking? How do we think about these types of things? So in this way, it's just rethinking the questions that we ask. And then ultimately, if we're not thinking about how something is wrong or something is pathological or something's broken, we think about different ways of being people. And that's part of what we're going to sort of talk about a bit. And a little bit is a personal journey, but also how we think about these. So here's Corey said Ed Ziegler, who initially what he called the developmental approach to people with intellectual disability. And what's interesting about Ed Ziegler is, his CV is like 500, 600 references in most academic journals. And he was a hardcore scientist in a lot of ways, at least what it was. And he wrote actually some of his articles were writing about methodological issues of developmental psychology, how we have to be really rigorous and really about academic rigor. But his science, he wasn't a scientist. That wasn't what enveloped him. He was also, it turns out, he was one of the 2 psychology people on the original committee that started the Head Start program in the United States. There were 2 psychologists, Prof and Brenner and Ziegler, and they started the Head Start program. He worked with every president. He worked with every president from Lyndon Johnson, who started the Head Start program in the States, to Barack Obama. And part of the reason I say that is that what's important about the message is that research and real people go hand in hand, right? It was that you can't have researchers who are sort of, in a vacuum. And although I don't think that any researchers are that much, thanks so much, are that much of a vacuum, it's not, because many of them do have clinics and that kind of thing. There's also the conceptual stuff, is how we think about it, right? One of the things going back to his days in the Head Start program, is that, I think there's Head Start programs here too, some variations of them. But the original Head Start program, there was such a rush of interest in it, that there was no effort. You say, what about our standards? What are we going to use for guidelines? Like, how do we know if it's working? So, we don't care, we're providing services. You can say, how do you know what it is, right? So there's this interaction that has to go. You can't have the researchers out there that have a conclusion, but also application. The intervention has to have some basis in the research. And that's how it goes. And so what I'm just trying to show is that also here, at the same time he published when I was in graduate school, a book called Understanding Mental Retardation, and a book called The Developmental Approach to Adult Psychopathology, which in a lot of ways seems like they're two totally different areas of research, right? What do they have to do with each other? But when I wrote about it, and we did this as a fetch shift to Ed, I think this is what I was trying to get about the developmental approach, is that the elegance of his work is that he worked with one idea, the development. It applied to all people, regardless of their backgrounds, problems, or stages in life. He saw as a common lens, which was to see people who beforehand were only viewed with regard to their differences or technicalities, right? You saw this premise of a more humanistic, I guess, type way of thinking about they can reapply, and that's where we begin. That's where we begin. Then here's, just to show you this, we had 2 feshers in this honor, one on his scientific work that we did with my colleagues, and Luzar just passed away, unfortunately, and then one also on his more policy side, and how these things go hand in hand. I'm just going to go through this just very quickly, because because the other thing, another paper that we're working on is what the autistic world has to learn from research in intellectual disability. And part of what he also did was that beforehand, all people with ID were considered one group. And we were just one group, they were grouped together as a homogeneous thing. The way that we compared them, we say whether they have pathology or atypicalities, was very problematic in terms of the research, in terms of the comparison between yet. And then there's always this quest for a specific common deficit, that somehow we had to find this one thing, right? It's called a defect, but there's one thing. And it didn't matter that people with defects had all sorts of different etiologies and sources, because if we could only find that one defect or deficit. And I think that there's some lessons, I'd love to discuss it at another point, that have also infiltrated the issues that we study with and that we struggle with in autism. And it was something that came up at the most recent INSAR meeting that we were at. What also is interesting about that came up at the INSAR meeting is this could almost be the same thing, but it's 60 years later, 50-something years later. So this is back in the day. So it should be strongly emphasized that rarely have behavioral differences characterized different etiological groups. Another saying, they're all the same, right? It doesn't matter how they got the intellectual disability. It does not matter. And these are all major researchers. These are top people in the field at the time. It does not create any difference how one gets to be, this is old language obviously, whether it's through bad genes, brain pathology, or seizures, the maturation results are the same. And this is something that the field struggled with. And it's something that, and then again here, even into the 80s, there's now skepticism as to usefulness of classifying mental retardation by form, there's our ability to separate biological and psychological forces. And this is what we face now in the autism world, right? People say, how do we make sense? We know there are so many different sources, but how do we make sense of them? And this is what we're struggling with thinking back, 50 years ago in the intellectual disability. And it's a lesson. And then 82, even easily diagnosed types such as Down syndrome do not display behavioral characteristics that set them apart. And we know that's obviously not true now. This is my first publication ever, so I always like to show. And there's a story behind it, which I don't want to tell you now, but I always happy to share. Because it was actually rejected by the people in intellectual disability and wanted to get published. But they didn't want to publish it because we were basically saying that you had to look at different etiologies separately. And it was none of it was like, back in the day when we used to send articles before email, right? It was actually hard, you were waiting. So it's my first ever article. It was a simple idea that you have to look at different etiological groups separately. And just from a neuroscience perspective, from a cognitive perspective, any perspective, social. And we sent it to the American Journal, at the time it's called American Journal of Mental Retardation. And remember the day when you had to send letters, right? You had to send a letter, you had to take 3 copies of the article, and this big thing and stick it in the mail. And then we get back an envelope. We get an envelope with the reviews, right? And I was so excited as a graduate student, the first couple of years as a graduate student, my first ever review. So we opened it, I'm so excited to get into my advisor's office, Ziegler's office, and not only is the paper rejected, the first reviewer says, this paper is not worthy of a high school essay. He says, what will they think of next? He says, next thing they're going to be telling us is that you have to differentiate between the 3 different types of Down syndrome, which are the trisomy 21 and the, I forget what they call it.
Mosaic and translocation.
Right. And translocation, right? And of course, we know that you have to do that now, right? There's differences between them, But they berated us so much because he's saying that we have to rethink the way we do it. And that's the issue where we are to some extent in autism, where people are trying to impose these ideas. We have to have a more fine-tuned understanding, and it's not welcome so much in the community. Anyways, this is the back and forth that we had, so we went against this. So the idea is that basically developmental approach is based on developmental constructs, and somehow the etiology is important. They have to know the questions that you're asking, who you're comparing, how you're comparing are important. And most important thing that Ziegler mentioned is that it's a whole child, right? That you can't just talk about their cognition, their function, response, and IQ tests, and that type of thing. You have to understand the child and where they're coming from, how their experiences. And that is part of the developmental story. And that led to his work on personality development. And that also is the developmental story. That the same developmental principles that we understand and think about with typically developing people are the same for everybody, for everybody. I'll just give you a quick example of that. Again, this is the way we think about people. When my whole career started, and I tend to say, I don't think anybody else can say this, that my whole career started as somebody who was somebody who wanted to make sure, like academic career started making sure the kitchen was kosher. I was in the camp in Canada for kids with special needs, and even though we had half the camp was Jewish, they wanted to make sure that everybody could go there, so they got this job. And I never met a person with special needs. And it changed my whole career trajectory. And so I was going to school in New York as an undergraduate, and but these people were all from Toronto. My parents lived in Toronto. So when I would come home on vacation, one of my campers was around my age, and my mother happened to live near my mother. And he was one of the higher functioning guys, quite on the spectrum. And he would keep me informed of the newspaper, he'd read it every day. And then my mother would invite him over to our house on a high holiday, like going back to Toronto to visit my parents. My mother would invite him. And one time I said, he never picks up the utensil, like a fork or spoon, until he sees which one you pick up. She says, okay, I'm going to check this out. I'm going to check out my mother's theory, right? And as you might be able to tell by my dress, we're not the most focal family in the whole world, So we just put the silver on the table, and you take what you need, we didn't reset the table all that much. So we serve the soup, and I see he's looking at me what to do. Right? He knows what to do, right? So an 18-year-old guy, he doesn't pick it up. And so I picked up a fork, and he had this quiz cool look. He knew it wasn't the right thing, right? And then I found it to this one sort. And that's what Ziegler called letter directive. Is that he's looking to the right. Now the truth of the matter is, and this is the main point, is that we're all other people, right? In the sense that in specific times. So let me say, my example is, now that there's a king of England, right? I'm sure he's going to want to invite me to dinner. And he's going to want to impress me, right? And he's going to put out this whole fancy meal with like five dishes and 4 cups and 3 wine glasses and 6, forks and 3 spoons. I'm not going to know what to do. So what am I going to do? I'm going to look at the person next to me, right? We're all are directed in certain contexts. But what Ziegler talked about was because, and he used to talk about that, because of the history of failure, the life experiences that people often had, even especially back in the day, when you're, when there's less inclusion, that people often feel, I can't take that chance. I'm going to be wrong, right? So, but they do it even in a situation, and this young man, he knew it was right, but he was so worried, he was so afraid, that even though he knew what to do, he was like, and that's part of the thing. How do we translate? So when we think about it, what are their life experiences? What's their life like? And trying to understand the whole person, what does it mean to be in that type of situation, in life experiences? So this leads us to Cicchetti and the point discussion. This is back in 1982. So now many of you, especially in psychology, probably read Cicchetti's work in different types of aspects with maltreatment, with children at risk, different cascading effects of morals and neuroscience and that stuff. But he started his early work at the University of Minnesota as a graduate student at Alice and others was in kids with Down syndrome. And he asked, and he was also replying to that, what he said before, the defect approaches. What's the differences, the defects or the disabilities of people with Down syndrome? And he says, in the defect approach, or if you're always looking for the problem, what's wrong, he says, it overlooks the possibility that the behavior of developmental retarded, it's the language different than we use now, is organized, adapted, and integrated, just like you would see in Piaget, just like you would see in any developmental theory, right? Just as is the case for non-child children and infants. We know that they are retarded, so that's not interesting. What's interesting is important challenging research questions concern the developmental process. So what he's saying is, instead of looking for defects, saying, hey, this is what's wrong, so it's trying to understand what is that overall developmental theory. And if you think about this, and this is what leads us into this whole, we'll talk about neurodiversity, is he's saying, even though we know that there's something we compare, we see that there's strengths and Down syndrome in certain areas and weaknesses relative in other areas, it's not some haphazard defect. It's not some haphazard thing, but there's an intrinsic underlying organization of development. So instead of thinking as this is a defective or is it a problem or it's pathological, we think it's an alternative way of being. It's a process. It's an alternative process of development, and that's the underlying idea. And he comes up with so the structure. So in this way, in the neurodiversity movement, we think this idea is reconceptualized as a natural variation in human behavior. It's a natural variation in human behavior. And it's in contrast with this historical frame. This is, you see this, these are, recent articles coming out, like some of the leaders in the field, in Pelicano's group, in Francesca Happy's group, people are talking about this, that we've been talking about autism, right? We've been talking about autism always as, and I'll talk about that also, different types of, the theory of mind deficit, weak central coherence, all these executive function deficits. We're saying that, hey, 1 second, it's not the deficit, it's how is this as a natural variation or alternative way of being. So the shift is going to focus on unique ways to process and respond is two unique ways that people with autism process information and interact with the world around them. And then we'll talk about the work that we've done about the process response to information in their environment, and that's part of what leads me into the next part of the talk. So the next part of the talk is really based, even though we wrote this grant in 2022, it was 4 years after Cicchetti and his colleagues asked this question. You see, we don't want to study does X have Y. In other words, can he do this or can't he do this? That's not the question we want to be asking. What we want to be asking is, what way does X, the person, use this way of processing? And does a particular mental structure interact with other mental structures in the same way in one group as in another? So it's ways of being, it's alternative ways of being, it's alternative ways of processing the world, it's alternative ways of interacting with other groups. It's not, does X have what, but how is it used? How is it the alternative way of being processed? So that is sort of the underlying part of what led us to our grant, the second part of the talk, is this grant that we just got funded. So again, it's something that we're thinking about and how we're doing it. I'm trying to lead you to how we got to this place that we got. And these are my co-investigators, Beth Kelly at Queen's, most Canadians are there at Canadian University, my former student Gracie Loach and Sam Fraser, Natalie Russo, my former student at Syracuse, my colleague Armando Bertoni at McGill. And we also have an autistic consultant, Eric Bruma, who I met. He and Ronnie Swagenbaum, some of you know, in Canada, co-chaired, Ronnie chaired and Aaron co-chaired a national agenda on autism. They were commissioned by the federal government to come up with a national agenda on autism through the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. And in the initial meeting of all the committees, Aaron introduced himself as the co-chair, and he mentioned something that really resonated because of the thing about this research. You can tell sort of on his jacket here, and some of these other photos, that here he is with Stephen Harper for a few years ago, the Prime Minister. And he mentioned this in his opening statement for our community, is he's fascinated with the Canadian military. That is, he knows everything about the Canadian military. He has models about different planes and tanks and this kind of thing. And he even has a commission to build a museum somewhere out east where he lives in Canada. And he says, and his goal is for autistic people to have more jobs in the military. Is Israel. He says his model is Israel, and it's not just having like a military where you have sort of special needs. Think of really, it's a model where you use taking advantage of people's special abilities. And he mentioned Israel as a model because of some of the stuff that he had read about. And so anyways, I reached out to him after and said, hey, we're working on this grant about attention, about processing information environment. I know you said about Israel, I'd be really interested if you'd be part of our enterprise and to join us as a consultant. And so he's part of our group also, our research group has come up and is going to have our, actually, now that we've got funding, we have our first meeting in a couple of weeks. He'll be doing, although he prefers to do by Zoom, and of course it's easier to follow. But so a lot of this motivation is part of his thinking about how we can somehow potentially have a model in Canada sort of maybe based on that is over there. So this is a paper that we wrote in 2016 with some of my former students and current students at the time. It's again, so paraphrasing Chicketti's work, we said how I attend, not how well do I attend. And sort of rethinking the developmental framework of attention and cognition. And that's how we sort of framed it was a thought piece in the Journal of Cognition and Development. And it was a special issue of the Journal of Cognition and Development that I co-edited with Lemire Akhtar and Vikram Jaswal. It was really intended to bring sort of atypical development to the cognitive developmental world. Until that time, I think there were only one or two articles in the whole history of the journal that had to do with sort of atypical development, so to speak. And they wanted to raise awareness, and so this is one of the articles that we published in that, which is our article, and sort of reframing this idea, and trying to, how these two ideas emerge was the typical and then our autism research. So I'd say, this is my dissertation paper that eventually became an article in the Journal of Neuropsychology. It's one of the first papers on attention in the autism world. So it's a sort of a, you may have called some mixing religions. It says that right, so back in the day, right, so this is my first really empirical big moment. I got selective attention deficits, right? And I think about, and that was the thing. I think that was a pretty general thing. We were thinking about deficits. It's in the Journal of Neuropsychology, and it's only do I have deficit, but I add to it by talking about it inefficient attention. And that really is kind of the thinking, right? This deficit, this is the problem. Let's find more problems, right? Let's find as many problems as we can get, right? And then, but I wasn't the only person doing this, right? So this is one of the most important, influential books.
Been translated into Hebrew?
Yes, a while ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah. And this is an amazing book. And Uta Frith, in a lot of ways, in this paper, she had also as an American scientist, or Scientific American, I can't remember which one, where she had a picture of what autism was, and this idea. If you remember, a friend of mine at the time was actually the autistic person. That there's a picture of an autistic person in a bubble, and you're saying if you could only crack through, and somehow you could find all these things, right? And it was very influential, broad awareness, but we were just at the beginning, right? We were just at the beginning. It was very influential, as something And in this, she began with the idea of weak central coherence theory, that somehow people with autism can only see the trees and don't see the forest. And that became one of the big, after theory of mind deficit approach, then we got the executive party, we got weak central coherence, became like the dominant thing. And it became a very dominant theory, weak central coherence. There's no way to do it for them to do it. They just couldn't do it. So they could see the trees and not the. And this is, you'll see, I'm going to go through three myths. So I should mention that 3 myths of attention research that we've addressed. And this is the idea again that you can see the big letters and not the little letters. The typical people see the big letters, not the little letters, and the people with autism can only see the little letters. And that was the theory. But we know, there's a little side there, right there, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we know there's all sorts of things that can affect how well we see any of these things, right? The density of the letters, how far apart, how big they are, And there's things where you can make it one more salient, either the right than the other. And there's all sorts of ways that we can manipulate that changes. So it happened. Okay, so we think this, but people, so that was common knowledge, right? So that weak central coherence is a really important theory, and people talked about it. But they placed that, speaking of Cambridge, right? You were Cambridge, right? Very Cambridge. So Kate placed it, who was right next door at St. John's College, right over from Simon Street. She and John Sweatten had, and it was this amazing article. Right, the amazing article where they looked at, and you can tell by the title that children, they show local precedence in divided attention tasks but global precedence in the selective attention task. So in the divided attention task, when they're forced to look at one or the other, their style is to look at more local. But when they're primed, or like other people are to look, they can do the global just as well as everybody. But it's not the style. And this became, at that time, it was an amazing fucking idea, right? It's not that they can't do it, but they can process information in a different way, right? And they process, their go-to, it's not that they process information, I shouldn't say that, what I should say is that their go-to, or their preference is to process it this way. And maybe it's not preference, but their style, I should say their style of processing is a bit different than that. And then there's other groups. Sally Ozanoff had a paper that shows something similar. And then Laurent and I had some papers with Janae and Gracie Rochi, and Gracie Rochi had a paper. It's all these papers that are saying it has to do with implicit the task biases. So again, it's not whether you can do it or not do it, but how you can be biased to look at one side or another way of processing information. So unexpectedly, I expected in terms of eccentric coherence, global processing was not impaired, and local, or the part processing, or seeing the trees, was not enhanced, right? It's just the style of doing it, and they're both okay when used separately, and intentionally part of global or local to the trees of the forest, but global processing when both are needed or in competition. So in other words, when attention is divided, they will tend to use one or the other, the local or the trees, as opposed to the other folks. And this partly led to the enhanced perceptual functioning theory that Laurent and I wrote about, both as a chapter and then also in a special issue of the Journal of Autism and JAD that he and I co-edited on attention and perception back in 2006. So we had this was our second iteration of this enhanced perceptual function model. We talked about the idea that the perception is not apparent in autism in some ways, it's enhanced, but depends again on what's being required and the specific path. And we wrote about that. So we had, and this paper has become pretty popular. But what's interesting also, it's there, no, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. It's not here, sorry. But in that same issue, so anyways, I forgot to put it, sorry. Oh, 1 second, I'm a little confused myself. I lost my spot, sorry. Okay. Oh, I see, okay, sorry. So in the same issue, the 2006 special issue, Happy and Frith revised their weak central coherence, right? They revised it, and now it is cognitive style, right? It's a style of process, right? And now it's in response to this series of, we should say, hey, we're not talking about a weak central coherence, but it's a style of being. And it really changed, I think, the way people think about it, at least not to say we haven't had other deficit series, but if we sort of cognitive knowledge psychology, it changed the way people think about it. How do they think about the way that autistic people process information? And this is all, and when I talk about this, one of the things, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why it's a discussion at INSAR this year, that my colleague Laurent Trump had a section about how do we understand autism? We understand it as this pure sort of autism that he's interested in, or broader autism. But I think I just have to preface by saying that this might not be replicable with all groups of people with autism, autistic people, right? It might not be replicable. And that goes back to this idea that there's so many different etiology sources you would expect. But there is this idea that at least in a group of them, especially people who tend to do, higher IQs and that kind of thing, that we might find this type of style would be a problem. Now, so that was rethinking that idea of this weak central coherence. So here's the second myth. Here's the second myth that came up. And this is Amit Klink's work from Yale.
From Emory.
Sorry?
Also from Emory.
Well, he's from Emory now, so thank you for clarifying that. But he is from Emory now, but this one he was still at Yale. And this is a scene from the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Have you ever seen that movie? Have you seen it? Previously?
What?
Have you seen Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? I mean, so I can't get to test this. It's an amazing movie. It's an amazing movie. It's probably one of the more nothing happens in this movie. It's like there's nothing happens.
A lot of talking.
Right, it's all talking, right? So it's all it's a translation. Nothing happens, and it's all very famous. Not that I can remember their names, but that's Richard Burton, Sandy Dennis, and who's the guy? I forget. Is it Richard Chamberlain? I can't remember. I even looked just so I remember. I can't remember. And you see, nothing happens except there's, of course, there's a lot of talking. And what they were interested in is seeing is eye gaze. And there was this idea that people with autism can't follow, or autistic people can't follow eye gaze. Right? They can't follow eye gaze. And you can see here, they're looking, the two male characters here are talking. And you see this character's name, of course, he's looking at Richard Burton, and you can see the white is the non-autistic people, and this is the autistic eye gaze, right? And you see that for non-autistic people, you'll see that there's this kind of regular triangle that goes between one's two eyes and this painting that's somewhere in the back there. You see that there's this clear, and for the autistic participants, it comes from somewhere around the throat and goes up, but it's not as clear, it's really not as clear, and there's not that eye-to-eye gaze that's going here. And that was part of the story, that inability to follow eye gaze, also reducing attention, and that was the common notion.
This was the only stimulus?
Sorry?
This was the only stimulus? So everything was based on that movie?
No, this is just
an
example.
It's an example. They also did a lot of different types. They wanted very much to have dynamic instead of just something physical. So they watched movies that were the way that movies people were watching. They also had the dots moving, and people saw that. And they had lots and lots of different methodological things.
Yeah. So, but let's give you an example. This is, And then here's another. Here you see also that we're looking at where the non-autistic people are focused right up there around the eyes, and for the autistic people it's more diffuse around between the two characters. Right? And then there's all sorts of data about the differences in who's looking at the eyes, and the autistic people are looking more at the mouth. Right? Where the action's happening, right? In some ways, So, how did that happen? So anyways, we worked with our colleague at the time we were still at University of British Columbia, Yale University, who was a graduate student, actually was our colleague of mine in the Department of Psychology at McGill. And they had an interesting paradigm that they had been using, and Chris Friesen, that they had been using following eye gaze. And it's it's schematic. It's a schematic. They wanted, in their work, Kingstone's work in consulting with Yale University, their work is really showing the power, the social power of attention, and how you have to understand attention as a social contract, even though we understand oftentimes we're more cognitive neuroscience, the social implications of it. And here's a schema. What they were showing across many different populations was that people follow eye gaze regardless. They just follow eye gaze. And it's like, nobody's going to...
It did it all by itself. That was very impressive.
I know, it's my... So anyway, so people follow eye gaze, and nobody's going to mistake that for a real person, right? And yet people still follow these non-social... It just sort of talks to the power of eyes to people. And in its initial paradigm, or this part of the control part, the idea is that if the eye gaze goes to one side or the other, and then the stimulus appears on that side, so it's the same side that the eye gaze went to, then your responses will be faster reaction times. And it pops up on the other side, it'll take longer because you're following the eyes, and then the thing pops up on the other side. It's a very simple paradigm, and you see that for almost everybody. And it doesn't matter, and so we see that it doesn't matter, in this case it's not predictive. Right? So it doesn't matter if the eye gaze go there, there's a 50% chance it'll be the same way as the eye. And we see that and this, by the way, I always tell my students, when you talk, never apologize, so I always never apologize. This is not to say control group, it should say comparison group. Because a control group is not, this is really comparison groups. This is one thing that Clifford can tell you that I obsess about. People use the word control group erroneously, but these are all comparison groups. But anyway. And you can see here in the comparison group that if it was if it was gazed at, the reaction times are much faster than when it was not gazed at, okay? And that's, so they're a little faster reaction times. In other words, indicating that they're following the eye gaze even though it's not predictive. It's not predictive at all. See? But with the autistic people, it doesn't matter which side the eyes went to, it doesn't predict their performance. Okay? For the autistic participants, it doesn't predict their performance. And this is when it's not predictive, right? So it can happen anyway, and it's not following. So people say, oh, here's another example where they can't follow eye gaze. But let's look what happens, although the computer wants to show us beforehand, right? But I'll show you. What happens when the eye gaze is predictive? Exact same pattern, virtually of findings. Because now it's important. Now it helps you do the task. So beforehand, it's not. But now it helps me fulfill the task. Now you say, hey, now I can. So it's not that I can't pay attention, I can't follow eye gaze, but it's this context, the situation to which it is. So that was myth number 2.
Can you go back for a second?
Yeah.
Excuse me, just, are the people with autism faster and better? I mean, not necessarily statistically significant, but does it look like they are?
That I can't tell you if they're fast. I'm not sure. It's also possible they are.
Yeah.
It's possible they are.
I just was curious because I don't remember
It's
seeing
possible.
that.
Yeah, it's possible they are. I don't remember, but I'm not sure, but certainly you can see that the pattern is becoming the same, right? The pattern becomes now it's becoming better. And then the third thing, which is more recent, this is with my colleagues, Henry Dawkins and Chapel Hill, Charlie Winter, and Jill Stewart and McGill, is this paper called Utilitarian Attainment by Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder on Visual Filtering Tasks. It was published in JAD 2018. And again, it was in response to this kind of deficit approach that I talked about that I had, but it wasn't just ours. It was, and in this paper that, I talked about how people with autism had a narrow attentional vision, overly narrow, and of course somebody else says the problem is it's too narrow, it's the problem is zooming out. So everybody's looking for some type of impairment, right? And mine was a deficit, this is impairment, right? And this is the idea, but, so what we did in this paper is we took some typical flanker tasks. It's not all very interesting. I think it's interesting, but it's a typical flanker task. There's nothing that's really, but what we did was 2 things. We looked at the distance of flankers, and also the time. This one was different than most flanker tasks. This was the manipulation, it was a temporal manipulation. Yeah, sometimes the flankers came on the same time as the target, and sometimes they came on either at some point after 150 milliseconds. And it also could, it's also the distance. We also vary the distance. So here, this is an interesting.
What is the task?
Oh, sorry, good point. It was, the task is you have it's a forced choice task. You have 2 buttons of X or O, and you have to, or plus or no, and as soon as the target comes on, you have to respond. Okay, so you have to respond. Thanks for asking. So as soon as the target comes on,
And what was your hypothesis in this?
Our hypothesis. I can't remember everything. No, our original hypothesis is, and when I say R, I'm not sure I should say R because I think that we didn't have agreement in our group what we were going to find. Was that there would be, the distance that they further ones would be more distracting to the audience. So the distance when the further ones would be more distracting, and the temporal.
Okay. Now, it's interesting to think about synchrony and asynchrony when we're talking about how you have to process the information, and that's.
So we'll see in a second why this is exactly your point comes to play. So we found for this group we find a distractor difference, and this was not expected. It's totally at least for me it was unexpected. Is we see that the typically developing participants show the pattern. And here the autistic people are faster. Yeah. Their abilities are faster in processing. But you see that as you get further away, greater distance, the typical participants show exactly what we expected, right? They're faster, you know, because the flankers are less distracted. But there doesn't seem to be this effect for the autistic people, right? And we struggle with that exactly, autistic participants. Why? Does that mean they're being over-distracted at every level? Like I sort of hypothesized, we weren't sure. But we see the typical pattern, the expected pattern with the typical developing participants. So it's more interesting than that, really, at least to me. And I think we're just showing the same, we're just showing the same thing here. That you can see here for the typically developing people, the close and medium distracted, I don't know exactly degrees, are more distracting, and as it gets further away, the reaction times are getting faster. But this is what's more interesting. This is the temporal asynchrony across all the different conditions. And here, when they come on at the same time, this is totally expected. I'd like to say I planned this, but is that when they came on at the same time, they were fast. The autistic participants were fastest, and when they came on close, they were still faster than when they came on later. When they came on sooner, or at the same time or early on, they were faster. And here, so now they didn't see the time didn't seem to affect the non-autistic folks, right? But there's a clear effect here with autistic participants. And we struggle with this. You know, I mean, it was totally opposite of what you would expect. It's totally opposite that you would expect that it comes right on to be the most distracting. So we kept thinking about this in terms of distraction. And it didn't make sense to us. Right? It didn't make sense as we're sitting, you know, Darlene came to Montreal and we're sitting around having beers and we're trying to understand it, so we just can't, you know, we're thinking about it. And then when we came up with this idea that maybe we're thinking about it the wrong way. We shouldn't be thinking about distracting, but that maybe we should think about it in terms of enhancing. So rather than seeing it as a distractor, you can see these flankers as a cue. It means your attention, it's not a complex task, right? Your attention is always in the middle, and these cues are actually they're narrowing your attention. So when you come at the same time, it's narrowing where you have to look at, right? And so we came up with this idea that this is actually a beneficial cue.
Like the eye gate for neurotypical eyes.
Sorry?
Like the eye gate for neurotypical
Yes,
eyes.
exactly. So we titled it, and that's where we came up with that idea of utilitarian attention. That in some ways, they're able, in these cases, autistic participants are able to take advantage of cues and information environment that other people aren't able to. And they're able to, it's utilitarian in the sense that they're not distracted by those things other people. It's more effective, it's more efficient. And the same thing getting back to exactly with the eye gaze. It's a more efficient way of attending, right? You're attending what's important, how it affects you. You're able to use these. And so we wrote this up, Darlene and I wrote this up in both Mark's handbook of autism as, as utilitarian attention. This idea that we can think about attention in a way that becomes more effective in a lot of ways, going back to, Aaron Luma's idea about how we can use special abilities, in different settings. So utilitarian is a style process that leads to a particularly efficient or effective use of attentional resources, that stuff. And it's driven by task requirements. This is something that Gracie wrote about a while back, rather than by the heuristics or social stimuli that may be of particular interest or relevance to others. So we're not driven by these heuristics and different types of things. And so now in our grant, we're going to explore this more, but we're also extending that idea to perception and following from Pelicano and Burr's work a little while ago on the Bayesian framework, where perception may be more accurate in autistic persons. It's a theory that they've come up with, but haven't really pursued as much, and it's guided by sensory information and less by prior knowledge. So it's what's out there as opposed to being influenced by the knowledge before the understanding. And in cognitively, we're also looking at, bring back to the UPU connection, a cognitive dual processing model, where there's, you got to get these two types of processing, quick and intuitive, dependent on experience and acquired heuristics. And some is slower, more measured, logical, more rational, little reliance on heuristics of past experiences. And it's not perfect, but we're trying to argue that, and there's been some evidence of this deliberate rational decision-making processing of autistic persons. It's not 100%, it's an interesting idea, Brosnan's related. Less susceptible to optimism bias when estimating the base rates of events. So, in other words, when an event happens, they don't become overly optimistic. The prior information is not influencing how they respond to an idea. They're less likely to be, the evidence of less likely to be affected by previous losses on gambling type tasks, and less swayed by advertising in some ways.
But it's so automatic as opposed to controlled.
Sorry?
Is it though automatic as opposed to controlled?
So that's the thing that we're kind of interested in understanding, is that idea, because in some ways in some ways, you know, we talk about it being faster in some ways, but what we're trying to pull apart is this idea that it's this automatic, but control, it's automatic in some sense, but it's less, it's less dependent on what's been there before. Mm-hmm. So that when, you know how, like, this experience that, you know, for those of us who drive in some way, when you drive home and you get home,
Yeah.
It's this idea. So, you know, it's that less process, but it's that, you know, during Bowler, who's my colleague of ours at City University, and I used to, when I was on sabbatical in England, but I spent a lot of time together. And, you know, so we would often stay at his house, and, you know, we often go for walks. And, you know, I always say to him, whenever we go for a walk, I say to him, I always want to do a study that autistic people are less likely to get killed. North American autistic people are less likely to get killed in England than me, or most people, because you know when you're crossing the street, right, you're looking the wrong way, right, you're looking the wrong way. And this idea about the prior information, how much prior information is, and how does prior information influence what you're doing, and that's the kind of thing that we're kind of trying to get at. And so I've always wanted, that's always been the study, we've talked about this for years, and every time we cross the street together. But, you know, so, and that's the idea of prior, how much prior information. There's another example I was going to give, I forget, but I think it all.
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yes.
And then quiz questions, everything. Okay, I'm finishing right now. Sorry.
I didn't mean for you to finish.
I can go on for that. I've been cutting down my stories. So this is really just setting it out. So I want to, one is like why I think the developmental approach is so important, is that I think that the idea of when you're guided by universal theory methodology, as opposed to sort of looking at always for a problem or pathology or a defect, you ask more fine-tuned questions. And that's that Ducati's how, not how well you're doing. And we focus on styles and biases and processing. And I think that was just more increased integrity of understanding the person as opposed to it's a whole person who's here. And with that, you know, from the humanity side of it, it's more inclusive or integrative rather than segregated. Right? And then it changes the discourse from defect to process. When you focus on the appreciation of individual differences, it will increase respect. I think that's really important. And I was going to end on that, which I always like to end on, but I couldn't because it's me, I was thinking about this. So I want to get back to our discussion of whether Bernstein and that I think is that question that, you know, of Kavanaugh. How do you have that? What's that intent? Right? Intent, and trying to understand as researchers, thinking about these ideas and what their meaning is for the greater population. What's that intent, and what's the effect on the people who, you know, who our orchestra, so to speak, is intended for? And the last thought is because I am a Montrealer, I would like to close with Leonard Cohen, right? And you know, who I just actually finished a great book about Leonard Cohen's visit here, Who by Fire, his visit here to during the war. So, you know, every song by Leonard Cohen is famous, right? But, you know, the ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect golf fingers, a crack and everything, that's how the light gets in, right? And I think that idea is important within the neurodiversity context, that we all we all have our cracks, we all have our different ways. And in order, and that's what really our life is about, is appreciating each other's cracks and how we affect each other. And, together, hopefully, it's this idea that, both for our research, but our everyday lives, that we think about these types of ways, and especially in terms of, autistic folks, is trying to understand, not as part of our, as part of who they are in terms of their ways of being and ways of life. So thanks very much. Thanks for listening. Sorry I went on for so long. I have to take questions.
We actually have some time for questions. Who and what would you like to clarify even more? I will just start by saying, I think that I had absolutely no idea where you were going with this when I got the title. And I have followed your research, and the way that you put it together here, at least for me, was incredibly enlightening. And I do think that the slide right before your concluding one, where we actually look at a developmental and humane way of thinking about difference, really does bring us to a place where we can respect and we have an integrity with what we're doing. So I just wanted to say thank you. Questions? I was giving you time to think about your questions.
I also want to say thank you. I've known you for 30 years, and I just think that was the most wonderful putting together of how your ideas have developed over the time. I really, really appreciate it. I'm really glad that I got here. Also, I just wanted to say something, I thought something completely different when I saw that quote from Leonard Cohen. I was thinking about Cicchetti and how, he always used to say that by studying where the cracks are, you get to know more about. So I looked at it as the light gets in because you're looking at where the differences are.
Well, that's a great thing about music, it's the intent. It's the changes, right? It's part of who you write, how we, right?
Didi has a question.
Yeah, I was thinking about the new ratio of 1 to 36 that was it was by the CDC a few months ago, and I remember reading it and calling Corey or watching her and telling me, what does it mean? Maybe your last slide shows that we need to rethink about autism.
I mean, and that's great. I'm not sure if you got that in Stockholm to Motron's session. But
We did. Both of us were there.
There also. I think
Yeah, it was
that's
It was one of the highlights of the whole.
Yeah.
I think the highlights of any. I mean, he's always a highlight, right? But he. But it's your point is exactly. It's the most important thing that we have as scholars, as educators, as professionals, and it goes back. To what they used to say in intellectual disability research 50 years ago, right? When I got the critique of my paper, right, it was exactly that. We can't do it, right? So why bother, right? But the thing is, you can do it. I mean, and we're still far from it, but there's ways to do it. There's ways to incorporate it. And I think and it's what worries me about, when we talk, some of the jargon, how we talk about, in terms of at least not having that knowledge that there's differences. And part of the biggest, I suspect this is true here in Israel as it is in Canada. The part of, even in my talk, when you're trying to see autistic people with autism, children with autism, part of that discussion reflects a big tangent, like it's true, and Corey and I talked a little bit about this, about whose framework we're coming from. So we're coming from, like my colleague Michelle Dawson, who's this brilliant scholar, and she considers herself an autistic person or an autist. She calls herself an autist, right? Versus a parent of somebody whose kid is, really struggling at it early, and it's a very different, different types of issues and different types of perspectives and different types of language. Even, and we all struggle. Even the journals are struggling. How do we refer? Because you have different you have different constituencies, different people. It's hard to the point. It's a great point. How do we think about it? And I suspect, and the changes that we've made, as Corey knows, the changes that we made to getting rid of Asperger's and all that stuff was very controversial. There's no real clear. I mean, it's a political discussion as much as it's been, days before they did it, do this, why this thing.
So we got rid of Asperger's syndrome, but now we have profound autism, so it's like back to the start.
Yeah, so it's such a hard, that's good. And it's going to be so many more. Like, we know that there's, I mean, there's hundreds of sources and reasons. It's hard to.
Thank you again, and we will meet again next academic year for our continued things, hopefully continuing to be challenged and learning. And I do want to wish everyone a good summer, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. If anybody's interested, if I can be of any help in any way, especially for students or faculty or postdocs, please reach out.